In May of 2026, Huawei stood in front of the world's press and unveiled something that Microsoft should genuinely be worried about: a fully working in-house operating system running on a real shipping laptop, built entirely to replace Windows on Chinese computers. This wasn't a concept demo, a distant roadmap slide, or a piece of marketing theater designed to sound impressive without actually delivering anything. It was running live, on hardware you could actually buy, and it marks the moment a plan that started years earlier, as damage control quietly became a genuine functioning alternative to the operating system that's run the world's computers for 4 decades. Tonight, we're walking through exactly how this happened, why it started as forced necessity rather than grand ambition, and why Microsoft, quietly, has every reason to be paying very close attention to what just happened. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to March of 2025, when something happened that almost nobody outside the industry noticed at the time. Huawei's license to use Microsoft Windows on its computers simply expired. Because of ongoing US sanctions against the company, sanctions that had already been tightening steadily for years by that point, Huawei wasn't able to renew that license, wasn't able to negotiate a new one through any available channel, and wasn't able to keep shipping new laptops with Windows pre-installed the way it had for years beforehand. For most companies, that would represent a company-ending problem. You can't really sell a modern competitive laptop without a modern operating system backing it. But Huawei didn't fold, and it didn't quietly exit the PC business the way plenty of outside analysts assumed it eventually would. It had actually been quietly preparing for exactly this specific moment for years already, and what it revealed in response wasn't some rushed, last-minute stopgap solution. It was the public unveiling of a much larger project that had been building steadily in the background since 2019. That project is called Harmony OS, and its origin story is worth understanding in detail, because it explains why what's happening now isn't some sudden opportunistic move dreamed up in response to a single canceled license. It's genuinely the second phase of a much longer plan that started with a completely different American company entirely. Back in 2019, the US government placed Huawei on a trade blacklist, cutting the company off from a wide range of American technology, including, crucially, Google's version of Android. Huawei's smartphones had relied heavily on Android for years by that point, and losing official access to it, along with the Google Play Store and every Google service tied directly into it, was a genuine existential crisis for the company's entire phone business at the time, one that plenty of analysts predicted Huawei simply wouldn't survive in any meaningful way. Huawei's answer was to build its own operating system entirely from scratch, specifically for phones, which became the first version of Harmony OS, launched in 2019 alongside the company's Honor-branded smart TVs as an early testing ground. For years afterward, that early version worked partly by running Android apps through a compatibility layer, essentially letting Harmony OS mimic Android closely enough that existing apps could still function reasonably well, even though the underlying operating system architecture was genuinely different underneath the surface. It was a functional bridge to keep the phone business alive, not yet anything close to a full, independent replacement. Then, starting in 2024, Huawei began rolling out something considerably more ambitious, called Harmony OS Next. And this is the specific version that actually matters for the Windows story we're focused on tonight. Harmony OS Next isn't simply a new visual skin layered on top of the same old underlying foundation. It's built around a completely different architecture at its very core, something called a microkernel, as opposed to the large, sprawling, monolithic kernel structure that operating systems like Android, Linux, and Windows itself have traditionally relied on for decades. A microkernel keeps the absolute core of the operating system as small and simple as physically possible, handling only the most essential functions directly within that tiny core, while pushing almost everything else out into separate, isolated components that communicate with that small core rather than being baked directly into it. The practical upside of this particular architectural approach is a system that's generally faster to start up from a cold boot, more resistant to a single point of failure taking down the entire device at once, and considerably easier to adapt across wildly different types of hardware, from a smartwatch to a smart TV to a full laptop, all running variations of the same underlying operating system core. And crucially, Harmony OS Next made a decision that the earlier versions hadn't been willing to make yet. It completely dropped the Android compatibility layer that had propped up the earlier phone versions of the operating system for years. Apps built for Android simply don't run on Harmony OS Next anymore, full stop, no exceptions. Every single app has to be natively rebuilt from the ground up specifically for this new system, using Huawei's own development tools rather than any Android-derived framework. On the surface, that sounds like it should have been a fatal decision for any new operating system to make. Cutting yourself off from millions of existing apps overnight is normally exactly how a new Operating system quietly dies in its first year, unable to convince anyone to switch when their favorite everyday apps simply won't work on the new platform. But Huawei made a calculated bet here, one built on a piece of leverage almost no other company in the world currently has available to it. An enormous, captive domestic market, backed by direct government support at multiple levels, and a level of coordination between the state and major Chinese software companies that simply doesn't exist anywhere else in the global technology industry. That coordination is exactly what's let Harmony OS Next avoid the usual death spiral new operating systems typically face when they launch without an established app ecosystem behind them. Rather than hoping developers would eventually get around to building native apps on their own timeline, Huawei worked directly with China's largest software companies well in advance of the actual public rollout, months, and in some cases, years ahead of launch. By the time Harmony OS Next launched broadly to consumers, major Chinese platforms including WeChat, Alipay, and WPS Office, essentially the equivalent of having WhatsApp, PayPal, and Microsoft Office all fully ready and polished on day one, already had complete native versions built, tested, and waiting for release. Huawei has publicly stated that more than 4,000 apps have already been specifically optimized for the platform as of this most recent announcement, with software development kits and direct financial incentives being offered to independent developers to keep that number climbing quickly throughout the rest of the year. That's a genuinely different situation than most failed operating system launches throughout tech history, where the classic chicken and egg problem, no users, because there's no apps, because there's no users, usually kills the entire project outright within the first year or two of its existence. Now, let's get to the actual laptop moment itself, because this is where the Windows story specifically comes fully into focus. In May of 2026, Huawei's consumer BU Sinus chief, Richard Yu, stood on stage and confirmed directly that Harmony OS is now running on the company's MateBook Fold, a foldable laptop representing Huawei's flagship hardware line for the year. This wasn't positioned as a limited pilot program, a niche experimental side release, or a cautious toe in the water test. It was framed clearly as the direction the entire product line is now heading going forward, with no ambiguity left about Huawei's long-term intentions. Alongside the consumer device, Huawei also introduced a separate, more traditional laptop, specifically built for government and enterprise clients, running Harmony OS as its primary operating system, rather than Windows from the very first unit off the assembly line. It specifically emphasized during the presentation that Huawei is actively working to make the system compatible with more than 2,000 additional apps beyond what's already running natively today, continuing to steadily close whatever gaps remain in the everyday software people actually rely on for work and daily life. It's worth being clear about exactly what Harmony OS Next is optimized to do, because it's not simply trying to be a generic Windows clone running on any hardware you happen to throw at it, the way some earlier Linux distributions attempted. It's specifically built to run best on Huawei's own in-house chips, including its Kunping processors and Ascend AI chips, hardware Huawei has also had to develop largely on its own, from the ground up, after losing access to certain American chip technology and manufacturing tools in the years since those same 2019 restrictions first hit the company. The operating system is also deeply integrated with China's domestic cloud and AI infrastructure, deliberately built to route around American cloud providers like Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services entirely, closing off yet another point of dependency on American technology in the process. In other words, this isn't just an operating system swap happening in complete isolation from everything else. It's one piece of a much larger, carefully coordinated effort to build an entire parallel technology stack, chips, cloud services, native apps, and now the operating system itself that doesn't depend on American technology or approval anywhere along the entire chain. And Huawei isn't the only company working on this particular problem, which is part of why this moment feels less like one company's isolated bet and more like a broader national shift finally reaching a genuine tipping point after years of slower, less coordinated progress. China's government has been pushing to reduce dependence on Windows for considerably longer than Huawei's specific sanction story even begins. Back in 2019, Chinese government offices were formally ordered to replace all foreign operating systems and hardware within a 3-year window, with roughly 20 to 30 million government PCs originally targeted for replacement during that initial push alone. Early attempts leaned heavily on Linux-based alternatives, including a distribution called Kylin, developed originally by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and later a more prominent successor called OpenKylin, backed by a state-owned firm called Kylinsoft, working alongside groups including the National Industrial Information Security Development Research Center and roughly 24 other partner organizations. Those earlier Linux-based efforts had a genuinely rocky history along the way. An early version of Kylin was famously found to contain code copied almost entirely, more than 99% by some estimates, from the open source FreeBSD project, a scandal that damaged the platform's credibility significantly for years afterward and became something of a cautionary tale within the industry. Progress on these earlier government-led alternatives had been genuinely slow for a long time as a direct result, with Microsoft Windows still holding somewhere around 85% of the desktop market share inside China as recently as a few years ago, and roughly 74% globally across the entire world, numbers that made replacing Windows SE considerably more like a distant political slogan than any kind of realistic near-term plan. What's different now is that Huawei's specific version of this broader effort has something the earlier government-led Linux projects mostly lacked from the very beginning: a genuinely competitive, polished consumer product, backed by real commercial pressure and market demand, rather than purely administrative mandate handed down from above, plus an app ecosystem that major companies were genuinely willing to actually invest real resources into building natively, rather than grudgingly tolerating through an awkward compatibility layer nobody particularly enjoyed using in daily practice. A government directive telling office workers to switch operating systems by a certain deadline is one kind of pressure, often met with quiet resistance and workarounds. A phone and laptop maker with hundreds of millions of existing loyal customers, deep manufacturing capability built up over decades, and its own domestically designed chips, shipping a genuinely modern, fast, well-integrated operating system that happens to also conveniently solve Beijing's broader technology independence goals at the same time, is a considerably more serious and sustainable kind of pressure, and precisely the combination that's been consistently missing from every previous attempt at solving this exact problem going back more than 2 full decades. So what does this actually mean for Microsoft, and for Windows more broadly, going forward? In the short term, genuinely not all that much changes overnight. Windows still overwhelmingly dominates desktop computing globally, and that dominant position isn't changing overnight because of one laptop launch event, however genuinely significant it may turn out to be in hindsight. Huawei's specific hardware line represents a real, but still relatively small slice of the overall global PC market compared to giants like Lenovo, Dell, and HP, all of which continue shipping Windows machines by the tens of millions every single year without any interruption to that arrangement. But the longer-term picture here is considerably more interesting and considerably more concerning if you happen to be sitting inside Microsoft's strategy team right now, watching this particular story unfold in real time. Huawei has just demonstrated, in a way no purely government-mandated Linux project ever managed to convincingly prove over the previous 2 decades of trying, that it's genuinely possible to build a modern operating system from scratch, successfully get major software companies to build genuinely native, high-quality apps for it well ahead of launch, and ship the finished result on real hardware that people actually want to buy, all within roughly 7 years of starting essentially from zero, with no prior operating system experience to build on. That's a meaningfully faster timeline than most industry observers would have confidently predicted back in 2019, when Huawei was first cut off from Android and widely treated by many outside analysts as functionally crippled by the American sanctions, specifically targeting it. There's also a broader strategic pattern worth sitting with here, one that extends considerably further than just Huawei specifically, or just operating systems as a narrow category. Chip restrictions push Chinese companies to build out the Kunpeng and Ascend processor lines from the ground up. Software restrictions pushed the parallel development of Harmony OS as a genuine Android alternative. Cloud restrictions accelerated heavy investment in domestic Chinese cloud infrastructure, specifically designed to route around AWS and Google Cloud entirely. Each individual restriction originally designed specifically to slow Chinese technology development down and preserve American technological leverage over the long run, has instead consistently forced the development of a parallel, increasingly self-sufficient technology ecosystem, one that doesn't need American approval, American licensing, or American technology to keep functioning and steadily improving it all going forward. Whether that particular outcome represents the sanctions succeeding or quietly backfiring largely depends entirely on which specific goal you're measuring them against in the first place. If the goal was purely short-term disruption, they clearly worked, and worked reasonably well, for at least a few genuinely difficult years for the affected Chinese companies involved. If the goal was preventing long-term Chinese technological independence altogether, the Harmony OS laptop rollout suggests that particular broader goal may be considerably harder to fully achieve than originally hoped, at least within any single company's specific timeline for building around it. None of this means Windows is disappearing anytime soon, either in China specifically or anywhere else in the broader world. Enterprise software built up over literal decades, deeply established user habits, and the sheer overwhelming inertia of billions of existing Windows installations currently running worldwide are all enormous. Genuinely difficult forces to overcome quickly, even with substantial state backing standing behind the alternative option. But The specific narrative that a serious, modern, genuinely competitive Windows alternative simply couldn't realistically be built by anyone outside of Microsoft, Apple, or the broader open source Linux community has become considerably harder to defend after May of 2026 than it clearly was even a single year earlier. Huawei didn't originally set out to build a competitor to Windows purely for its own sake, chasing some abstract ambition to dethrone a global tech giant. It was forced directly into this exact position by a single canceled software license, and it responded by turning years of accumulated, sanctions-driven necessity into a genuinely functional, competitive operating system, one now running quietly on real hardware, sitting on real store shelves, while much of the world outside China was still busy, assuming the whole ambitious project would eventually just quietly fail the way so many previous attempts had before it. It's worth remembering just how unusual this entire trajectory actually is within the broader history of the technology industry. Building a genuinely competitive desktop operating system from complete scratch is widely considered one of the hardest engineering challenges in all of modern computing, which is exactly why so few companies have ever successfully pulled it off at scale. Apple had decades of prior operating system experience to draw on before macOS reached its current polished state. The Linux community has relied on millions of collective volunteer hours contributed freely across more than 3 decades of continuous incremental development. Huawei, by comparison, effectively compressed a meaningful fraction of that same kind of progress into less than a decade under direct external pressure, without the luxury of years of quiet, unhurried iteration that most successful operating systems have historically enjoyed along the way. If stories like this, the ones that connect a single canceled software license all the way to a genuine shift in the global balance of technology power, are exactly the kind of deep dive you come here for, make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on, because this particular story is still actively unfolding in real time, and the next update on HarmonyOS's continued progress could tell us a great deal about exactly how much longer Windows can realistically count on being the only serious, credible operating system in the room. Further, we will discuss in our next upcoming videos. For now, subscribe our channel to stay tuned for every new upcoming video.